I will just make this brief so we can give Malcolm as much time as possible. I guess to me, I'll say really briefly about how this came about. As a doctoral student, I did a lot on papyrology and found Malcolm's work, a book that was published in 2006, Belief in Cult in 4th Century Papyri, to be very, very useful, and began corresponding with him via email and met him at the SBL, which I think many of us are probably going to in the next day or so. And when I arrived here, I always thought it would be great to have him come and visit us. Of course, the problem was it would be a little difficult bringing him in just from Australia for the talk. And so when I saw the SBL was in San Francisco and everything was lining up, I thought, wouldn't it be great to bring him out the week before? And ANES has very graciously provided some funding to do that. So we're very happy that all came together and worked out. Malcom is a senior lecturer in the Department of Ancient History and Core in Ancient Cultures, and a member of the Macquarie University Ancient Cultures Research Center in Sydney. His research interest is Greco-Roman Egypt and the interaction of classical and Egyptian cultures from Alexander the Great to the Arab conquest, and focuses a lot on early Christianity. Published widely, as I mentioned before, his book, Belief in Cult in 4th Century Papyri, came out in 2006. He has another book, which will be known as, I guess, as P. Macquarie 1, where he recently edited Coptic Magical Codex, which should, I believe, come out next year, 2012. In addition to that, it's published in various places, articles, a lot on monasticism in Egypt and the laity. And he's going to present to us today on 2 Christian monastic communities. And so, without further ado, I'm going to turn the time over to Malcom.
Thank you for that introduction, Lincoln. And before I start, let me thank the university, and particularly the Departments of Ancient Scripture and Ancient Near Eastern Studies, Professors Blumell and Professor Dana Pike, for facilitating my trip here, and the Kennedy International Centre for hosting me today. It certainly is a nice place to be presenting, and thank you all for taking an hour out of your day to come and hear me talk a little bit about some recent work that Macquarie University has been doing in Upper Egypt, and a little bit about monasticism in Upper Egypt in late antiquity, and the changing nature of the use of sacred space in Egypt over the period from the 4th to the 8th century. You can see there, I'm going to be talking about 2 sites, and although I'm standing here before you, it's representing work of quite a number of colleagues, generously funded by the Australian Research Council, whose generosity I am supposed to acknowledge every time I speak, but I'm just remembering to do that now. It's probably one of the more important times to remember it when I'm overseas. So you can see the names of my colleagues there, and they're a mixture of Coptologists, art historians, and Egyptologists who have done a lot of work on this site. So don't get the idea that this is a production of myself alone. For those of you that, well, if you don't know where Egypt is, it's up on that map. I'm assuming everyone does. We're talking about the Thebaid in Upper Egypt, of course, and specifically we're talking about the area across the river from the modern city of Luxor, across in the old, in the pharaonic necropolis in western Thebes, around where the Deir el-Bahari, the so-called northern monastery, is marked on this map. It's probably no surprise which mountain the Egyptians chose to think of as sacred in the area. That's what in late antiquity was known as the Holy Mountain of Jama, on which most of the mortuary temples and tombs, particularly of the New Kingdom period. And I just show you on this slide a brief overview of some of the major monuments in the area. Many of these will be familiar to many of you, of course. We have the mortuary temple of Hatshepsut, the Deir el-Bahari, the Valley of the Kings behind that, where Tutankhamun's tomb and many other pharaonic tombs are, the Valley of the Queens further to the south. One of the best preserved monuments, the mortuary temple of Ramses III, now known as Medinet Habu, and the Ramesseum down further to the east there, the less well preserved mortuary temple of Seti I towards the north. And sort of in line with that, over at the north there you can see the Drab ul-Naga, which has a large amount of 18th to 20th dynasty tombs on it. And that's largely what I'll be talking about today. And you can see the mortuary temple of Amenhotep III right down the bottom, whence the colossi of Memnon, so-called. This just to give a brief overview, which is probably unnecessary, of the sort of nature of sacred space in the pharaonic precinct in the necropolis there. The monuments of that era will mainly be familiar to many of us, I think. The colossi, the Valley of the Kings, down at the bottom right, Medinet Habu, and at the bottom left, the bottom right, the heavily reconstructed mortuary temple of Hatshepsut. Not much more, I don't think I want to delay on that, except for you to fix in your mind the nature of this area in the pharaonic period, then to cast forward to what the traveller Strabo says in the 1st century AD. There were several temples, but now it is only a collection of villages, he says. And that's the title of an interesting collection of articles on the Theban region, published recently, above the Memnonion, by which I think he means Medinet Habu. There are caves, tombs of kings, which are stone hewn, about 40 in number, of course, there's hundreds more than 40. So by the Roman period then, despite the fact that this was still an area of pilgrimage, and we can see epigraphic traces of Hadrian's visit to the area on the Colossi, it's no longer as vibrant and as sacred a space as it was in the dynastic period. What I want to do during this paper is to cast forward to late antiquity, and particularly to the 6th to 8th centuries AD, when this mountain was remade as new sacred space, as monastic sacred space, when monasteries filled the larger temples, when monastic cells filled most of the smaller tombs. And if we look at Western Thebes in late antiquity on this map, we can see that most of these major monuments have transformed into monasteries. And the ubiquity of the word Deir, Arabic for monastery, in the title of most of these places gives you some indication of how widespread monasticism was on this mountainside. You can see down the bottom, Medinet Habu has become the village of Jama. The Deir el-Bahari is the monastery of Foibaman. There are monasteries at the Deir el-Medina and the Deir el-Rumi. I'll come to them in the valley of the, that is in the Valley of the Queens and in the pharaonic workman's village. And on Sheikh Abdul Gurna, the sort of mountain in the middle there, which you can't really see on this top-down map, there are relatively substantial monasteries headed up by people called Epiphanius and Kyriakos. They weren't called that in antiquity, but that's the name of famous monks there. There's the Deir el-Bahit on the Drab al-Naga, and on the Drab al-Naga itself, to the north, a number of smaller monastic settlements, one of which I'll be looking at today. This is the mortuary temple of Hatshepsut, and you would not, I think, to look at it, realize that it was one of the largest monastic complexes in Western Thebes. This was the seat in the late 6th and early 7th century of the bishop of Hermonthis, modern Amant, Abraham, who, on his taking up of the office of bishop, settled in the monastery of Foibaman, or perhaps moved the monastery from further out in the desert into the central position where you can oversee the whole western plain of Thebes. This was how it looked in the 19th century before Edouard Neville began to excavate it. You can still see that the monastic tower is standing and some of the walls, and that was all cleared away to reveal the New Kingdom Temple, for better or for worse. I'll just quickly cycle through some of the late antique remains that we can see in these major sites from earlier periods. In the Deir el-Medina, what you see at the bottom is the Ptolemaic temple that was there, and it became a monastery, and you can see some Coptic graffiti up to the upper left there, as well as some mud brick remains within the temple. This is the monastery of Epiphanius, which is the tomb of Dagi, the 11th dynasty vizier, and it is the best known because it was the best excavated by a Metropolitan Museum of Art expedition in the 20s, and the best published. So although it's not the most major monastic settlement in the region, because the monastery of Thebes was barely published at all. There's just some sketch maps and photos of what it looked like. Whereas the monastery of Epiphanius had its late antique phase properly excavated, we know a lot more about that, and that's on the northern end of Sheikh Abdul Gurna, and the Ramesseum is in the background. The imaginatively titled Pit 1152 is just a little monastic tower sitting up behind the Deir el-Medina in Sheikh Abdul Gurna. You can see again its monastic tower. You can see it's a pretty inhospitable environment, but I want you to realize here, and probably some of you already know this, that even though this looks like the desolate desert, it's only about 15 or 20 minutes walk from the village of Jama. So this divide between the civilized, cultivated land and the desert is not a hugely geographical divide. So monks can live in the inhospitable desert here, but be a short donkey ride or walk from civilization. Pit 1152 is excavated by a Polish team and is famous largely for the finding of 3 or 4 complete Coptic codices there a number of years ago, which are in the process of being preserved and studied now. At a Roman period shrine in the Valley of the Queens is the Deir el-Rumi, the monastery of the Romans, being excavated by French and Belgian scholars, and substantial archaeological remains. As you can see, mud brick and some stone. It was an earlier tomb too, of course, that the sanctuary was built around. And the local civic centre, which gives its name to the mountain, is the village of Jama, which fills the old enclosure wall and the temple, or the mortuary temple of Ramses III, Medinat Habu. You can see at the top left what remained when the University of Chicago began excavating there earlier in the 20th century, and how it looks now when that's pretty much all stripped out. But as you can see around the edge of the enclosure wall, there's still some remains of these mud brick houses. And in this old photo from the 19th century, down the bottom right, you can see the remains of the church that was in the second court of the temple. So this was a thriving little village with like 3 or 4 story mud brick houses, which was the local contact point, if you like, for these monasteries. And so the mountain, which you see in the background there, is called the Holy Mountain of Jama, the Mountain of Jama because that's the closest village. So I'm just going to cut back here now to say what I'm going to focus on here, which is not so much the southern end of the necropolis down near Jama, but the northern end of the necropolis on the Drab al-Naga, the closest village to which would have been the village that grew up in the mortuary temple of Seti I, whose name we don't know. And it hasn't been quite so well excavated. Note that on Google Maps, the el-Bahari is about 3 or 4 kilometers from where it's supposed to be, so don't necessarily trust Google Maps if you want to know exactly where something is. This is a picture of the Drab al-Naga from the southeast, looking from the modern shops towards the hill. And in that saddle in the hill, to the left of that picture, which I mean up here, is the largest monastery in the region. And this is the Deir el-Bahari. Now you can see that from the name of the Deir el-Bahari, the northern monastery, that's not in fact an accurate designation, because there is a monastery, in fact a much larger monastery to the north. And this is the Deir el-Bahari, and people have been puzzled by this name because Bahit is not any Arabic word that people know. But Parhait could be a Coptic word. Parhait in Coptic means the northern. So it's likely, in fact, that Bahit is just a loan word from Coptic, and that also means the northern monastery. So there are 2 monasteries called the Northern Monastery, one in Coptic and one in Arabic. But no one actually knew the name of this monastery until very recently. People speculated that it might be the monastery of Thebes, or it just might be some unknown monastery. And they didn't know where the monastery of Apopoulos was, Apopol, which features in many documents from the Theban region and was obviously a major monastery. And just recently, the German team excavating the Deir el-Bahari has found decisive proof of what a lot of us suspected to be true, that the Deir el-Bahari is the monastery of Apopol. And this always made sense to me because the monastery of Apopol is called Pikolol, the monastery of the cup. And if you look back at where it is, you can see that there's this sort of saddle, a cup in the hillside. And this is what its nickname referred to, the sort of topographical setting of what was, as you can see, a major monastic settlement active throughout late antiquity, with cells, storage warehouses, and now being excavated by a German Archaeological Institute team. I want to focus on these two tombs, TT 233 and 149, on the Deir Naga, a couple of 100 meters further north of the Deir el-Bahari. You can see the monastery on the satellite map and the tombs, and you can see their relationship here on this map from Frederick Kamp's book. And there they are there. And as you can see, the entire hillside is covered with tombs, many of which were used by monks in late antiquity. And there you can see a picture taken by one of our students from a balloon, one of the many balloons you can ride over the Theban region, which shows our excavator's tent out the front of TT 233, Theban tomb 233. And 149 is directly to its right, and just over the hill is the Deir el-Bahari. So one of the things we want to work out in the Macquarie mission, which is excavating 233 and 149, is how this little monastic community there relates to the big monastery over the hill. I'm going to go fairly quickly through some shots of these two tombs, or one monastery, as you might say, just to give you some context. So we have mainly excavated TT 233, which is further, where you can see the excavator's tent in the bottom photo, and have not touched the courtyard yet of TT 149, but you can sort of see some mud brick walls sticking up through there. And you can see in the top photo there how close it is to the civilization. So just beyond in that fog would be the temple of Seti I, and so you're probably only about 15 minutes walk or so from a village in late antiquity. There's a schematic plan in which I've boldly drawn in some of the mud brick walls that I can see in 149, which remain to be a bit confirmed, but that gives you an overview of the pharaonic tombs, and you can see that there's two tombs, both reused there. They're from the 18th and 19th dynasties, and I could talk more about them if I had more time and if this was a talk about that phase of the tomb's usage. One interesting architectural feature, by which we know this was actually inhabited in late antiquity, is this oven that sits, and you can see it sits at the front of TT 233 there. They call it the Coptic oven. What they mean is an oven dating to the late antique period that projects from TT 149 into TT 233 and shows that this is actually used whether for living in but certainly for the baking of bread in late antiquity from the 6th to 8th century. And you can see on this slide that the floor level is much higher in late antiquity, so that that dividing wall in the middle of TT 233 there, it's post 18th dynasty, but it's before the Coptic phase of the tomb, if you like, and it was probably showing there at least, and then they would have had use. As far as we can tell in TT 233 by looking at this distinctive plaster wash that the monks put on the wall, they had used pretty much of the entire complex. What we need to do in the future is excavate the courtyard of 149 and see how these mud brick walls, which must be contemporaneous with the monastic habitation of 233, see how they relate. Hopefully we'll get to do that in January, and there are just some more shots of those mud brick walls, which aren't anything much to look at now, but I confidently predict we'll find huge amounts of complete Coptic codices in there. Of course, what I would like to do in the future is figure out the relationship between these two little monastic cells and these mud brick structures up on the hillside just a couple of minutes walk above them. You can see them up there, actual freestanding buildings sitting on top of the hillside facing north. And there you can see, taken from a shot from down near Howard Carter's house, you can see them up on top of the hill. The things you can see, actually it's a bit misleading. These things are actually rocks, and the structures are just below there. And then there's also tombs with monastic remains all down in here as well. That's a picture of Howard Carter at Howard Carter's house. You can go and hear him speak about how great it is. But he praises Zahi-Hawa, so that'll probably have to be changed now. And this is a few pictures of the structure up on the hill. You can see it's got a beautiful view north. It could have been some sort of watchtower, or it could be in another entire monastic community up there. So what we want to know is, does this little monastic community in these two tombs, these two cells, is it a satellite of that, or of the Deir el-Bahari, or is this part of the Deir el-Bahari? That all remains to be understood further in the future. When you go to the Theban region, and in most parts of Egypt, you'll find the ubiquity of mud brick remains, all mainly dating from the Roman and late Roman, and sometimes later periods, of course, because people still build in mud brick, with mud brick in Egypt. Not so much of it survives now, in a way because mud brick, of course, is not as durable as granite or limestone or some of the other building materials used for use. Although you can see it is remarkably durable in some senses, but it weathers much more easily and can come to appear to just be a mass of boring mud, basically. The other reason is that Egyptologists weren't, in the past, have not even been really remotely interested in these late antique remains. And so while there are now some fine examples of Egyptologists who are properly recording this late antique remain and getting a full history of the site, in the past you had people like Naville who just ripped the Coptic remains off the top of the mortuary temple of Hatshepsut, the Deir el-Bahari, without really recording him at all. And even his fellow Egyptologists at the time recognised that that was not a sensible way to proceed. But for those two reasons, often the record of the late antique phase of Thebes is a little bit confused, and we have to piece things together from museum archaeology and from travellers' reports, sketches of how the Deir el-Bahari used to look, for instance, old photographs of the Deir el-Bahari, notes and letters that people wrote while they were excavating saying, oh, I found a Coptic tower, but we swiftly tore it down, or something like that. And we are now starting, through the work of a number of very fine scholars, none of whom is me, certainly, to be able to piece together a proper topographical map of the Western Thebes in late antiquity. Now, one of the reasons why we're able to have a much better idea of the monastic habitation of this region than we would have been able to if we just had the archaeological record to go on is substantial textual finds from Western Thebes in late antiquity. That is, there are literally thousands of texts on papyrus and ostraca and limestone, graffiti and dipinti from the region in Coptic and some in Greek. And we're fortunate enough to have some of these in TT233, which enable us to build up a preliminary picture of the monks who lived there. Inside the tomb on the eastern wall of the Broad Hall, which has extremely interesting hieroglyphic remains. If you're interested, check out the publications by Boyo Ockenga. If you're interested in that, we find some Coptic graffiti, which I'll quickly show you. There they are, painted on this grey plaster wash the monks put down. And mainly what you expect to find. Some names of saints, some names of monks. Dioscorus, of course, could be either. Georgios could be either. I take it that he's probably a monk who wants to be prayed for. Dioscorus could be the Patriarch of Alexandria. These, I think, are inhabitants of the tomb: Dios, Jeremias, presbyteroi and anchorites. Presbyteroi avo anachoretes. Ezekiel at the top could be the name of a monk. It's a common enough personal name in the Theban region in the 6th to 8th century. But the word Ezekiel, or the name Ezekiel, keeps showing up on top of these inscriptions, which makes me wonder if it's something of an invocation. And you can see here it is above the list of apostles and the bishops of Alexandria between 300 and 383. Peter, Achillas, Alexandros, Athanasios, Peter. And Ezekiel just sitting at the top. Now maybe that's the name of the monk who wrote this, or maybe that name is being used as some sort of invocation. Out in the courtyard of 233, we found a substantial amount of papyrus fragments, mostly over by the oven, which led the Egyptologists to wonder if they were being used to start the fire, and ostraca scattered around the courtyard. So we have about 150 ostraca and papyri, nearly all in Coptic, and the paleography, that is the handwriting, suggests we should date them to the 6th to 8th century. And what I'm going to do in the next few minutes is just run you through a few of the ones which seem to us to be interesting and to be worthy of a preliminary publication in advance of a full publication of the late antique phase of the tomb, which could be some years away. We have in the tomb all the main genre that you normally find in these monastic assemblages. Lists of names which could be either saints or prominent monks or actual monks that lived there. Prayers, this one naming the 3 youths from the book of Daniel. Sections of scripture copied out. I've called this one a meditation text, but I'm not actually sure if that's the right designation for it. One could think of it as an educational text, although the writer seems pretty well practiced in writing, certainly. But this is not an uncommon genre amongst the monastic ostraca. Then we have things that are certainly writing exercises. Here someone is just copying out various unrelated words. And note here that they're actually copying it out in what's a pretty nice style of handwriting that wouldn't be inappropriate for a literary production. This is an example of a very common type of Coptic writing exercise, practicing writing the start of a letter. And here Andreas the Less, who we take it as one of the inhabitants of the tomb, is practicing writing the start of the letter. Andreas it is who wrote all the words. Andreas it is who wrote all the words, farewell in the Lord, beloved brothers. And then writing like a page number, but an actually impossible page number. Practicing writing page numbers at the side. And on the back, he just practices writing a lot of letters. And then there's one on papyrus where someone is just practicing writing the letter M, mu. Beyond that, which shows, I think, this common phenomenon of writing and literacy in these monastic communities, we have a list of Old Testament books from Isaiah through to Judith, maybe indicating one was on parchment. I imagine they had 7 copies of the book of Ezra, but you never know. And other little tantalizing fragments. So this is a little scrap of papyrus. It has the page number 177. So originally, of course, it came from some deluxe codex with 177 pages. Of course, we don't have the codex. We just have page number 177. So we left to imagine what that was. But it's interesting nonetheless. The most common form of document we find in these West Theban late antique assemblages is letters between monks and the inhabitants of Jama, between monks and bishops, and we have a number of them from TT 233. There's one written by Johannes on the right. You can't really make out the name of the writer on the left. Fragmentary, but you can get a fair idea of their content, and they're mainly the sort of day-to-day business that these places transact. Send me a book, give me some grain, why haven't you come to visit me? Sorry, I don't have any papyrus. What is of most interest to me is a character Posidonius, who was the somewhat very classical name of Posidonius, Poseidon, who shows up in 4 of these papyri. Now, Posidonius is in fact an extremely uncommon name in late antique Western Thebes. There's 2 papyri from the Deir el-Bahari from the 7th century that have that name in it, probably the same guy. And beyond that, all the mentions of a Posidonius refer to a monastery of Posidonius down on the so-called mountain of Armant, quite a bit south of where we are. So this is virtually an unattested name on the mountain. That's a pretty fragmentary letter. These letters are even more fragmentary, but I confidently restore Posidonius in the 3rd line on the left and the 2nd on the right. I think that's a reasonable assumption. We have Donius and Onios. And then also his name can be read with the basis of parallels in this much longer letter. Totally complete on the right and largely so on the left, in which someone, whose name is of course lost, writes to Posidonius, complaining about someone else, asking him to solve a problem, and complaining about the fish, which I don't really understand how that fits in. And that's just showing you where the Deir Posidonios is, the monastery of Posidonius, down on the mountain opposite Armant. And the Deir el-Bahari is way up the top there. And there's a single interesting Greek document, which is addressed to Upper Plinios and Abraham, presumably not the famous Bishop Abraham, and is, again, it's some sort of declaration about the ownership of land. It's interesting that it's in the monastery, shows the use of Greek still at this date, of course. We're probably in the 7th century here, right at the tail end of the use of Greek, end of the 6th, start of the 7th century. But it can't be completely related, onomastically at least, to what we have in the graffiti and in the ostraca. And it's an interesting fact that the graffiti, the ostraca, and the papyri don't have much onomastic overlap between them. So either we're looking at 3 generations of monks that lived in this cell, or some of these ostraca or papyri might have come from elsewhere. Certainly the graffiti can't have. So we're looking at a conjoined group of little cells, inhabitants by small groups of monks in the 6th to 8th century. You can see some of the names that arise there. Engaged in education, letter writing, maybe mediation and property issues, copying of literary texts perhaps. So in the future, we want to work out a number of things. We want to work out the relationship with the Deir el-Bahari, and we're working closely with the excavators there to work that out. We want to work out the relationship with those monastic structures, or whatever structures they are, up on the top of the Drab al-Naga. And we need to, of course, fully publish this textual and archaeological remains, and we need to closely compare it with nearby material and other Theban material, and to properly excavate TT149. And we're very lucky that we've got Egyptologists involved who are very interested in understanding this latest phase of the tomb's habitation so they can get a complete picture of its use from the dynastic period, from the New Kingdom, through down into the early Islamic period. So we hope thereby that this will be one little piece of the puzzle in understanding how the mountain of Jema, the West Theban necropolis, articulated itself in late antiquity, how it became again a place of pilgrimage, people coming to see famous monks when before they had come to see the temples and the tombs, and that we can, together with international colleagues, help further understand that. In the last couple of minutes, I just want to show you just a few images of another site we've been working on in Sohag, further north, and we've worked there for a couple of seasons, and it's very preliminary work, but it raises some interesting questions. Modern Sohag is across the river, as many of you probably know, from the city of Akhmim, which is the ancient Panopolis. And across from Panopolis, when we're talking monasteries, it's dominated by the White Monastery of Shnute, leader of the White Monastery, so-called, it wasn't called the White Monastery then, in the 4th and 5th century, and further to the north, the Red Monastery, part of the Shnutaean Federation. Further south, at the late antique village of Atripe, built on top of a temple of Ptolemy XII, is the female monastery of the Shnutaean Federation. Where we're working is about 5 kilometres further south at the site of Hagasa, where the escarpment bends around, and where we found a monastic settlement on the old kingdom tombs at Hagasa that was excavated many years ago by Naguib Kanawati. And so it's sort of hidden from sight from these Shnutaean monasteries further north. And on this escarpment, which you can sort of see the openings of the tombs there. Sorry, this was taken directly into the sunlight. It's not the best picture. You can see the openings of the tombs there, and the whole hillside is covered with mud brick monastic cells and with caves with monastic remains which have never been recorded. And I'll just quickly show you that we have a large stone structure, which is probably contemporary with the monastic remains, with barrel vaulted rooms and stairs. We have cells, mud brick cells, way up on the mountainside. Nice view you get from there. We have inscriptions on plaster in some of the cells. This is the best preserved one. It was a lot better preserved when someone took a photograph of it 20 years ago. It's broken off a bit, but we have their photograph. And we have caves with not only artistic remains, but these monastic genealogies running around the walls, which you commonly find at monastic sites. That monastic genealogies is just my term. They just list, as did the previous inscription, this huge long list of monks, which I take to be important to that community and sort of be regarded as their monastic forebears, if you like. Now, then we have other caves. Here's our inspector standing in one of them, packed full of niches, and again you can see the red line running around with the monks' names at the top. There's our inspector and our site guard with his gun outside. And some artistic remains. Here's what looks like two lions in a stool in the middle, which makes me think of this, but it's probably, of course, this. And so we want to work here. We've just got some funding from the university to go back again next year to document this monastic settlement. These monastic settlements are all up and down the Nile, and a lot of them are undocumented and decaying rapidly. We want to preserve this one. Map the cells on the mountain, plan some of them more in detail, fully survey the texts to establish the date of the settlement, the extent of its habitation, and particularly the relationship with this massive monastic federation, the Shnutaean Federation of Upper Shnute, just to the north. What's interesting, if we look back at the inscription, is that Shnute, or his disciple Bisa, or anyone like that, aren't actually mentioned here, but it starts with the so-called Bawiti trio, Upper Apollo, Upper Anup, and Upper Pib, or Upper Pif. These monks who founded and were very important to the monastery of Upper Apollo at Bawit, north near Ashmuna, Hermopolis. Now, a lot of it's broken, and then you can see Upper Pamun, the father of this mountain. So in consequence of this, we're just calling this for now the Monastery of Upper Pamun, and we want over the next couple of years just to record this site so it too can be fitted into our general picture of late antique monasticism, of this type of Egyptian monasticism that's off the map in terms of the famous literary sources, but which covered most parts of the escarpment in the second half of the first millennium AD. I believe that that's about enough for me to say today. Sorry for that rushed survey through this work, but I hope it's been of some interest, and thank you again for your time.
Any questions for Dr. Choat?
What other parts of the world have I gone to study? Yeah. You mean in my university studies?
Yeah, all of it.
I mainly undertook my education in Australia. During my PhD, I went and spent 6 months in Oxford, working in the libraries there. And also, while I was doing my PhD, I spent 2 seasons sort of being trained on site in archaeology in Jordan, working in a little village in southern Jordan. And that's the main extent of the geographical thread of my education. And since then, I've learned and worked on site in Egypt mainly. So yes, I'm a proud believer, if you like, in the Australian educational system. I don't mind saying that I did my doctoral work there, but I'm very conscious too of the fact that we're quite isolated in Australia, and it's important for our graduates to get out and see a bit more of the world. So I encourage them as much as possible to travel during their doctoral degrees, either certainly those of them that wish to go overseas and study, I encourage them, but those of us that want to stay, I encourage them to spend a year or a semester somewhere overseas. And hopefully some of them would be welcome here if they chose to spend some time here. I encourage them to just basically go where there's an expert in their field and sit down in the library, because sometimes actual cooperative arrangements can be early. Sorry, I'm rambling off about that now, but that sort of answers your question. Thank you, sir.
Yeah, I just had a question. How did the monastic communities there come to an end?
Gradually, for a number of reasons. After the Islamic conquest, taxes began being levied on churches and monasteries, not immediately, but progressively, so that a number of these monastic communities, which had elaborate land holdings and employed large amounts of people, had previously enjoyed a largely tax-free experience. Their economies became much less self-sustaining than they were before. So that seems to have accounted for some of the disappearance of some of the monastic communities. In another sense, as a consequence, but not as a direct consequence of the Islamic conquest, in that they were immediately persecuted, but as a function of what they did to the Coptic community. They sort of withdrew to more parts of towns and bigger monasteries, and so some of these smaller monastic communities contracted into larger ones, so that monks came down off the hillsides into the bigger monastic communities, came from outlying cells into the big monasteries in the Wadi Natrun or the monastery of St. Anthony. So smaller ones, monastic communities conglomerated, if you like, and then over time, particularly in the second millennium AD, the monastic lifestyle seems to have become less attractive for reasons that I'm not entirely familiar with, but could probably be elucidated through closer study. And the monasteries became less and less populated, to the point where there were very few monks outside the Wadi Natrun and the monastery of St. Anthony and Paul when the first European travellers arrived. And then over the last 100 years, there's been an upsurge again in Coptic monasticism. And so there are now 20 monks at the monastery of St. Shenouda, the White Monastery, where there were virtually none 100 years ago. And the monasteries in Lower Egypt, excuse me, in the Eastern Desert are flourishing again. But yeah, so basically over the first half of the second millennium, for reasons of just changes in society and in the way these monasteries used to articulate themselves, they gradually became uninhabited.
So these would illustrate the life of the monk and where they would have been in daily life. What about that next step? What is known about where were they buried? What was there any commonality in terms of the shared space, sacred space for that particular day?
This is an extremely interesting question, and I thank you for it, because not at 233, but at some of the monasteries further south, on the Sheikh Abdul Gurna and at the Deir el-Bahari, there are actually monastic burials alongside the monasteries, sometimes in the courtyards of the tombs, sometimes, say, at the Deir el-Bahari just off to the side. And so we have the use of that space also as for cemetery purposes. We have good examples of late antique mummification practices from Sheikh Abdul Gurna in particular, from the monastery of Kyriakos, from the monastery of Epiphanius, and from the monastery of Foibaman at the Deir el-Bahari. So it looks as though in many cases they maintained this tradition of using this area as space for burial as well, and presumably up in places that just no one's thought to look, because there doesn't appear to be anything up there and you're not going to go and dig on top of the hillside. So there was no tombs, but definite burials. So they continued that as well. Not so much as a sort of veneration space, and not with as much fanfare as the New Kingdom tombs, but they did continue using the space in that way as well.
In terms of these tombs, a number of these places around burial places, have you found many bodies there, buried bodies? Are they long since gone and already kind of sacked, things like that, or are you finding what might you say about burial practice, or are you finding many bodies here?
Well, I mean, a lot of the tombs still contained the sarcophagi and the bodies from the New Kingdom when they were investigated in the 19th century, and that's why a lot of them are sort of cleaned out. People would sort of go in, excavate the chambers, find the sarcophagus, and bring it out. That's what happened at the the monastery of Epiphanius. Maspro or someone like that had taken out the sarcophagus of Dagi and just left the rest because he thought it was boring. And in a number of tombs, there are burial remains from late antiquity. In 233, there is not the body, and it may be because the sarcophagus of Saroy, the 18th century dynasty, person that was buried there, the 18th dynasty noble, was all smashed up in antiquity. So the sarcophagus is fragmentary, so presumably his body was destroyed long ago. There's a nice statue of him in the Luxor Museum, however. So not in every place, but in many places, because people weren't, the grave robbers who have basically gone through the whole necropolis, weren't really interested in robbing the bodies as much as the gold and other precious things that were around in the tombs. But there's no hint in 233 or 149 of any post-pharaonic burials in the area, but that there are at the Deir el-Bahari, and I don't doubt there are somewhere on the Deir el-Naga that we haven't looked at or found yet.
You mentioned that you were going to return in January, hopefully. Is that pretty well settled, or is the political situation?
Is anything settled about going to Egypt at the moment? Look, all we can do is put in the request to work and ask our Vice-Chancellor for permission to travel and see what happens. So on the current electoral schedule that the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces has established, there are supposed to be 3 rounds of elections starting next week and then in December and then again in January. So I figure that gives us 2 rounds of elections to see how it's playing out. So even in the Mubarak era, the elections were always pretty fractious in parts of Egypt. So they're probably going to be more so this time, you would imagine. Just as a rule of thumb, there'll be more arguments than there was under Mubarak. So I'm prepared to just call that off if that happens. But I'm also conscious that that Luxor is probably going to be one of the more safe places, not as safe as working out on one of the oases or something, more safe places in Egypt because it's generally not a very dangerous sort of town. And I don't get the sense that the trouble will be from Egyptians towards foreigners, that there will be, I feel confident predicting, trouble between Egyptians in the election. But I'm going to make a call in early January. And I mean, I don't mind not going. It's not worth going if it looks like the whole country's exploding. But I would like to go. So I've booked some tickets and we'll see what happens. That's the best I can say at this stage. But not everyone in my family is enthusiastic about me as going, as I am. I'll say that much.
All right, one more time, let's thank Malcom Choat.